Afiya de Sormeaux. She's currently a graduate student in the Economic Development Policy at Solesis. She has an MSc in Marketing and Agribusiness. Her focus right now is on water access and climate change. Ms. Sormeaux.
Thank you. Hi, good morning, everybody. So I'll be presenting this morning on fostering agricultural development by reducing vulnerabilities. This is work I'm doing with Dr. Sharon Hutchinson. This presents an overview of how the presentation will go. I'll give an introduction which goes into details as the scope of the project, the vulnerability, what is the vulnerability framework that we use, the methodology, the key results that we found, and the implications for agricultural development, and the conclusions. In terms of the scope of the paper, this is part of a bigger project. It's a water access project, and the main objective or aspect of it is to look at sustainable livelihood indices for access, to determine the impact of climate change on water availability in 3 watersheds. So we looked at the New River, the Carriacou, and Spicetown in Barbados. But for the purpose of this presentation, we'll just focus on the New River catchment. IPCC defined vulnerability as the degree to which a system is susceptible to or unable to cope with adverse effects of climate change, including climate variability and extremes. In terms of, when we're speaking about vulnerability, there are 3 distinct factors that must be looked at: exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. So for a community or a watershed, high vulnerability would be a situation where you will have high exposure, high sensitivity, but they have low adaptive capacity. While the low vulnerability they'd have low exposure, low sensitivity, and they would be able to adapt easily. So the overall aim for this is to assess the potential impact of climate variability on water access via water resources, ecosystem health, vulnerability, and adaptive capacity for the residents of the New River watershed, and I've highlighted where it is located in Trinidad. Specifically, we calculated a livelihood vulnerability index for householders. We identified the aspects of the community that contribute most to the vulnerability, and then the implications of the vulnerable pillars to agricultural sector development. So the methodology used a survey where we interviewed 343 householders from the 3 main communities in the river, the Beach, Cascade, Kernahan, and Plumitan. And this was done during the period August to October 2014. The data was collected generally in 6 general areas. So information on general environment, the changing climate, the benefits from nature, the access to water and the quality of life, the family and community ties, and the socio-demographic information. Okay, so this is the framework that we use. There are six pillars were defined, and under each pillar, there are subcomponents that make up the pillars, and then a number of specific indicator questions would have fall under each pillar. So specifically, in terms of, so we had environmental capital, physical capital, social capital, human, economic, and natural disasters, and climate variability. And these would have been merged to create an overall LVI for the community. When we speak about looking at the environmental capital, agriculture, we would have asked questions in terms of their farm size, the animals that they reared, the crops, what type of irrigation systems they use, their water, right. So, like I said, so in calculating the index, relevant indicator questions from the questionnaires were selected and they were matched with the subcomponents. So, and then for some questions, like, for instance, do you own a vehicle? We recorded them because if you said yes, you own a vehicle, that would have been assigned a higher vulnerability than not owning a vehicle. And generally, the questions had to be normalized because they would have been in different ranges. So we normalized it to get a range between 0 to 1. So then what we would have done is we took the average of the subcomponents for each household, and that would have given you the household vulnerability index, and then an average of that would have led to the community vulnerability index, and then we would have got the weighted average for the overall LVI for the overall the watershed as a whole. As I said, the LVI was scaled from 0 to 1, 0 being very low vulnerability and 1 being very high. And below I have the scale that we used. It was adapted from FEMA. So we had from very low would be 0 to 0.14, and then very high would be 0.85 to 1, and then in the middle, in medium, would have been 0.43 to 5.56. In terms of the results, this displays the results that we got for each of the pillars, and then the overall value for the river. The most vulnerable capital would have been environmental, and they had a value of 0.63. Overall, the river had a value of 0.454, so they would have fallen in the medium category, but the environmental pillar would have been a medium-high level of vulnerability. As I stated, the environmental index was made up of biodiversity, agriculture, and fresh water. And what we found is that in terms of farming, the average farm size would have been 3.8 acres in size. The largest farm would have been over 25, and the smallest would have been a quarter. And we found that only about 48% of the persons who we surveyed said that they engaged in farming, and then they had different values in terms of the number of persons who engaged in crops or livestock. In terms of the water quality, in terms of we asked them in terms of if they observe changes in terms of the quantity and the quality of water in the waterways, and most people indicated, 61 and 64, that they noticed a decline in the water quality and the quantity. These would have contributed to making their environmental capital, and as it relates to agriculture, making them more vulnerable. Generally, in terms of the other pillars, their social capital pillar would have been the next vulnerable aspect, and they had a medium vulnerability of 0.55. And what we found is that they had weak linkages in terms as they related to their they only 22% of them indicated that they had a strong link with their community and that they could have obtained help assistance from persons in their community if they needed help, and that 16% of those indicated that they could have obtained information from their community groups. And then they had their least vulnerable pillar would have been their physical. And so what we found is that their physical pillar looked at their water availability and their water access. And while only 18% of the respondents indicated that they had water piped directly to their dwelling, more than half of them, 58%, indicated that they were able to store over 800 gallons of water. So while they are vulnerable in terms of their access to water, because they're relying on truck-borne water and they have to store a lot of water, they're less vulnerable because their storage capacity is not as weak. Generally concluding, like I said, the river had a medium level of vulnerability. Most of their vulnerability came from the environmental and the social capital pillars. And their least vulnerable pillar would have been their physical capital, and like based on the information before, we found that generally, if a community has strong social ties, it would be less vulnerable, and this would help. So we saw that their social ties are weak. So if policies or activities can be put in place to help strengthen those ties, it can help make them a little less vulnerable. And while they are rural, their agricultural assets are low because most of the householders didn't indicate that they were taking part in agricultural activities. And generally, the NLVI is good for identifying a community's vulnerability levels, and specifically it lets us know which areas they are more vulnerable in, and that it can be used to affect policy change in terms of their water access. Thank you.